So I want to talk about, you have this election, 1899, which was very similar to the 2019 election. Very similar indeed. It's just basically switched, but essentially the Republicans used to be liberals. The Republicans were the ones that ended slavery. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. So the Republicans used to be good, and the Democrats were the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, and they were white supremacists. So the Democrats used to be bad, and then 1964 they switched. So in 1899 Kentucky, there's only one governor in the entire United States that's ever been assassinated, and it was William Justice Goebel, and it was because of the 1899 election. So William Justice Goebel is only going to be in there for 3 days, and he's going to die. And he said, always be fearless, always be loyal and fearless for the common people. So always fight for the common people was his last words. I love William Justice Goebel, but he was a bully, and he tried to steal election, and actually he did steal the election. So in 1899, you're going to have two main candidates, a Republican and a Democrat, and then you're going to have the honest election Democrat because they didn't like how Goebel won the Democratic convention. So John Y. Brown is going to be your third party. So what happens is Taylor, I want to say it's William S. Taylor, I'm not sure, but Taylor versus Goebel. So Taylor's a Republican, and Taylor wins. Taylor gets 194,000 votes. 194,000. I think is that a higher turnout than Kentucky? Okay, so he gets 194,000, and then Goebel gets 191,000. So that means William Justice Goebel lost the election. And then it goes to the State Board of Elections, which is what's happening right now in Kentucky. It goes to the State Board of Elections, and they certify that Taylor had won. So Taylor wins the election of 1899. Taylor is certified by the State Board of Election, but then Goebel contested the election for voter fraud. And the Democrats, in order from them, the GOP, so the House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives in Kentucky in 1899 were all Democrats. And so it's the exact opposite, but it's the same, right? So you have a Democrat who lost. The House and the Senate are run by Democrats, and you have a situation where they went ahead, the House stole the election, the Democrats stole the election for William Justice Goebel, took the election away from Taylor, and Taylor, even though he won the election, was certified by the State Board of Elections, is going to lose this thing, and then Goebel's going to get shot and killed. So Goebel was able to get the House. There's Rule 90, Section 90. Section 90 says that if there's a contestant, if you contest the election for governor or lieutenant governor, they have to come up with a procedure, essentially, to figure out how to figure it out. So they started investigating voter fraud. They threw out a bunch of votes, and then once they threw out all those votes, then they said, okay, Goebel now wins. There's 3,000 votes, so they had to invalidate at least, for 3,001 of the people who voted for Taylor. Section 90 is very specific, and it says the contested elections for governor and lieutenant governor shall be determined by both houses of the General Assembly to such regulations as determined by law. So the General Assembly is now, if Bevin has 30 days to contest the election, he has called for a recanvass. He hasn't called for a recount yet. He probably will call for a recount too. But then you got Bush v. Gore, and then you got the 1995 11th Circuit Court case, Roe v. Alabama. Roe v. Alabama says you can't come up with a procedure after the election to come up with, how you're going to do a recount. The election is the most fair thing out there, and so if you went ahead and did this recount, that's Bush v. Gore too. So Bush v. Gore, I got a lot of issues with it, but they said that election is a vote on equal terms, whereas afterwards the state may arbitrarily, in disparate treatment, they may value one person's vote over another vote when they do the recount. So he's pointing out, Matt Bevin is pointing out that there's thousands of absentee ballots that were illegally counted. A bunch of people were turned away, and a bunch of machines didn't work properly. So did those Diebold machines get hacked? A number of people were turned away. Thousands of absentee ballots illegally counted. So all he needs to do is invalidate 5,000 votes. If he can invalidate 5,000 votes, then the House can go ahead and declare him the winner. Now, that would be stealing the election. Now, excuse me. The best thing that we should do is to actually just redo the election if it is a contested election, and I think that Andy Beshear would actually do better than what he did this time. So the fact that they're even floating Robert Stivers says he floated the idea of letting the House steal the election because John Hicks was in it. So he said because the Libertarian votes probably would have gone to Matt Bevin, therefore Matt Bevin's the actual governor. Well, that's not how democracy works there, Robert Stivers. So the fact that he's trying to stifle, the Libertarians from even running, you're not even allowed to run, it just shows you how scared the Republican Party and the Democrats are of third parties. So if Stivers is, complaining about John Hicks, that doesn't invalidate the election. What it does, if you say that they needed a majority, but it's a plurality winner, you get ranked choice voting, but that's fair. They won't do that. So Robert Stivers floated the idea that Section 90 says that the House, who is governed by the Republicans, so the House and the Senate today in 2019 are being run by the Republicans. So just like in 1899, the Democrat loses, and then the Democrat House and the Senate steals the election. So it is possible. History teaches us that Matt Bevin can steal this election. He can steal this election through the House. But history also teaches us that his next term won't be very long. So what happens, this is all about the John Y. Brown and Taylor and Goebel election. So the Democrats in the General Assembly started investigating. Goebel gets shot, and then the Democrats in the General Assembly voted for the investigation, so they invalidated enough votes to make Goebel the governor. And then on January 31st, he's sworn in, and then he dies February 2nd. So only 3 days was William Justice Goebel was he governor. But they got Taylor deposed, they accepted the report, and then they declared Goebel the governor. And so that's what happened in 1899. Taylor v. Beckham. So what's interesting is that Goebel was going to get shot, and I love William Justice Goebel. William Justice Goebel stood up for the textbook, stood against the textbook monopoly, stood up against the railroads, stood up against the corporations, stood up against the toll booths. He stood up for the farmers, he stood up for the worker class, and he stood up for the union. So he stood, even for black votes and for women who didn't have a right to vote back in them days. So William Justice Goebel is a badass. He's a progressive Democrat, one of the few, the first progressives that actually come out of the Democratic Party, and he was also German. So the fact that you actually had a progressive Democrat in Kentucky. So the people that hated Goebel was everybody. All the powerful people hated Goebel, and the Democrats who were Confederates hated Goebel. The Republicans hated Goebel, so they all just hated William Justice Goebel. And even though I liked him because he's a super-duper progressive, he is stealing this election. There was an election, and then it gets overturned by the House, and it's like, what the fuck is going on? But after Goebel gets shot, because the Republicans, they were saying, you know what, we will never have Goebel be governor. They were ready to go to war. There was a civil war that was ready to happen, and they were not going to let Goebel become governor when he got shot, and then he dies. He's governor for 3 days, and he dies. Then the lieutenant governor, J.C.W. Beckham, just go with Beckham. So the judicial branch goes in Taylor v. Beckham. The Kentucky Court of Appeals ruled that the General Assembly had acted appropriately in giving the election to Goebel, and John Marshall Harlan dissented, which would be an interesting dissent to read. SCOTUS refused to hear the case, so the U.S. Supreme Court wouldn't hear the case, therefore giving the Kentucky Court of Appeals the last laugh to give them, that their ruling is going to stand. So Goebel is shot. He's going to be sworn in as governor. Goebel's going to die. Beckham's going to become the governor. They're going to fight it out in the judicial branch, and they're going to say that Goebel deserved the election. Beckham is now the governor, and the Republicans were more in a conciliatory position because, Goebel was now dead and gone forever, so now he was a martyr. Now it was like, oh my God, good old Goebel, good old Goebel. What did they do to Goebel? There's a Goebel Park, and so anyways, the judicial branch sided with the lieutenant governor of William Goebel, so therefore Beckham gets the governorship. So Goebel, even though he got shot and he died, he did take the governor's chair. So he's a martyr for the cause, a martyr for the progressives, And because he was able to be declared governor and then died later and his lieutenant governor took it and then he won in the judicial branch, he successfully stole the election. I love William Justice Goebel, but he stole this election. He stole this election. Now, there is corruption and vote buying scandals, so until you actually look at the investigation, but essentially, Bush v. Gore makes sense. That sentence, that one sentence about how elections are fair and equal, more fair and equal than a recount. A recount's going to say these votes count, these votes don't count. They're going to invalidate absentee ballots. So you're invalidating absentee ballots? Does that mean they didn't turn it in right? They didn't cross their T's, dot their I's? How come they're counting all these absentee ballots? So, if they might have found 3,000 votes that had been, not proper. So it could have been just, it could have been okay, but you'd have to get down to the nitty-gritty of the thing, and ultimately, the election is the people's will, it's the people's choice. So a contested election shouldn't go to the House, it should go back to the people. If there is, enough of irregularities or illegalities to justify it or warrant it. So what happens at the very end? So you're going to have William Justice Goebel's going to get shot and killed, right? So Jim Howard, he's seeking a pardon from Taylor because he had murdered somebody in a family feud. So I think he's from Clay County. So you had a Clay County feudist who had killed a man, and Taylor had said, "I'm going to pardon you." So that was his motive. Jim Howard was going to get a pardon from Taylor because he had murdered somebody in a feud, and that pardon was going to excuse him forever and ever. Caleb Powers, Henry Yaltsey, and Jim Howard are the only three people that's going to get convicted. And Jim Howard got convicted 3 times. So people act like they don't know who killed William Justice Goebel. Caleb Powers was a mastermind. Henry Yaltsey, he was part of the conspiracy, but he turned state's evidence, and so that's why we know what happened. He's going to get a life sentence. Caleb Powers, he was Taylor's Secretary of State, and Henry Yaltsey pointed to Jim Howard as the trigger man. And so Jim Howard was tried and convicted 3 times. He's going to get pardoned in 1908. So 7 years after he had shot Goebel, he's going to get pardoned. So I don't know if he got pardoned from the feud too, but he got pardoned before Henry Yaltsey, who got pardoned in 1919. So 18 years later, after Goebel was shot, Henry Yaltsey, who was state's evidence, gets to see his freedom, but Jim Howard, who was the guy who actually killed him, tried and convicted 3 times. He's going to get pardoned 7 years later. And then Taylor's going to run off to Indiana, and they never did anything. He becomes a successful lawyer in Indiana, but Taylor, loses Taylor v. Beckham. John Marshall Harlan had dissented, so I think that dissent would actually be pretty relevant. It would be interesting to read what his dissent was. But that's the story of the 1899 election. So the 1899 election between William Justice Goebel and Taylor and John Y. Brown, the vote totals, John Y. Brown winds up getting 12,000 votes. So John Y. Brown is the John Hicks, Taylor is the Andy Brashear, and then William Goebel is Matt Bevin. Matt Bevin, loses, and the State Board of Elections is going to certify Andy Brashear, but Matt Bevin is going to try to be like Goebel, and he's going to try to steal the election. John Y. Brown had 12,000 votes, so once again, if Kentucky had ranked choice voting in 1899, John Brown's votes would have been redistributed, and you would have actually found out who had the majority of all the votes. 12,000 votes beats the 3,000 vote spread, just like John Hicks. 12,000 votes or so beats the 5,000 vote spread. So ranked choice voting would end the spoiler effect and make it fair, and you get more power to the people. They get more choices. They get to rank all the candidates. You had 3 choices, so number 1, number 2, number 3. Or if you didn't like one of them, 1 and 2. It's simple. It's easy to do, and it gives you more power for the people. It's more power to the people. So they fought it in court. Beckham won. Taylor fled to Indiana. So, yeah, that's the 1899 election. They did. Goebel successfully stole that election. And Section 90, which is what Stivers is talking about, he's talking about stealing this election. So you got to watch out for these damn Republicans. This is also a precursor. Matt Bevin was a precursor to Donald Trump 4 years ago. Bevin got elected, which means Donald could get elected. And now Bevin got kicked out, which means Donald is probably going to get kicked out too. So Kentucky has been a good bellwether. Kentucky's been a good weather vane. good pulse, finger on the pulse of the nation, apparently. And so, yeah, this is a referendum on Trump, and a bloody red state just threw out, Mississippi elected a Republican governor. Big shocker there. Yeah, thanks to Trump. Trump took credit for that. So Mississippi elected a Republican governor. Anybody surprised? Nobody would have been surprised if Kentucky would have elected a Republican governor, but they elected a Democratic governor. They threw out the incumbent, which generally the incumbent has the advantage. They are in power, right? So the incumbent has the advantage. 95% of the time, the incumbent wins. But the Democrats was able to, stand up this time, and they kicked Matt Bevin, to the curb. But now they're trying to talk about stealing this damn election. The only stance I would take is either redo the election or just shut the fuck up and, quit crying sour grapes. You lost the election. They all keep saying, well, Donald, they just won't accept that he's president. Accept that you lost your election. Accept that Andy Beshear is now the governor. You lost your election. If there's enough votes and, they point out that there's more than 5,000 votes, then maybe you should have another election with ranked choice voting. Or just have another election anyways. Andy Beshear kicked Matt Bevin's ass again. John Hicks will get even more votes coming up. So that would be good. That would be the best way to go forward, because a recount behind closed doors in the House in Frankfurt, you're stealing the election. And that's straight up. What the fuck? You can't do that shit. If there's ever a time to, Section 4 of Kentucky's Constitution says we have a right to a revolution. So if there's ever been a time to declare revolution, it would be when the powers that be don't step down after they've been democratically elected, democratically kicked out of office. That's the time. Section 4 legalizes revolution, so you can have revolution in Kentucky. So that's 1899 election, right? Goebel, I like Goebel. He shouldn't have stole the election. Section 90 doesn't make any sense. A contested election goes to the legislature. Send it back to the people. And then you need more initiatives, too, Kentucky. Shit. And the Victims' Bill of Rights should have stood up, so you already got judicial shenanigans that fucks the people's will, the people's of Kentucky's will over anyways. So anyways.